Frankie Sterling never meant to marry Shin Woo-jin. One rushed mistake. And suddenly, she was legally married to the cold, distant COO she couldn't stand. A national identity audit forced them to live together. But the man she thought she knew wasn't the man she was living with. He was protective, steady, unexpectedly kind. Not like a man pretending to be her husband. Like a man who meant it. Then the audit ended. They were free to walk away. Frankie hesitated. She thought she knew exactly how it would end. And Woo-jin said, no. And Frankie needed to understand why. The elevator doors closed on the 47th floor, and the silence they stepped into was a different kind than any they'd shared before. Frankie stood in the far corner of the elevator, her hands folded in front of her, watching the floor numbers descend. Woo-jin stood on the opposite side, as still as ever, his reflection a dark column in the mirrored panel beside him. The distance between them was perhaps 4 feet. It felt like 400. She could still hear it. One word, spoken in a cold conference room to 3 legal professionals with their crisp folders and their printed forms. No. Quiet and absolute, and somehow the most destabilizing thing anyone had ever said to her. Not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. Because it had sounded, impossibly, like the truth. The car was waiting. She got in first. He got in after. His driver, a silent man named Park who had clearly been briefed, at some point in his career, that his job description included selective deafness, pulled smoothly into Seattle traffic and said nothing. The rain came down against the windows. The wipers moved. The city slid past in shades of gray and wet neon. Frankie watched it and tried to organize herself. She failed. By the time Park pulled up in front of her building, she had arrived at precisely nothing. No clarity, no category, no tidy professional framework in which to file the events of the afternoon. She got out. Woo-jin followed, because of course he did. Because his things were still in her apartment, and they had not yet had the conversation the elevator had been too small to contain. She unlocked the door. She went inside. She turned on the kitchen light. She stood in the center of the room she'd lived in alone for 2 years. In the apartment he'd moved into with 2 bags and proceeded to quietly improve until it felt different than it had before, and she turned around and looked at him. He was standing near the door, jacket on, hands at his sides, watching her with those dark, patient eyes. Why did you say no? She asked. The question sat in the air between them. He held her gaze for a moment, and she watched something move behind his expression. Something that looked like the particular effort of a person deciding how honest to be. I didn't want it erased, he said finally. Low, measured. Each word laid down with care. I didn't want to pretend the last 2 months were nothing. That you were nothing. A beat. I didn't want to lose you. Frankie pressed her lips together. Her heart was being extremely unhelpful about all of this. Woo-jin, I know, he said quietly, and the 2 words carried so much in them. Acknowledgement, restraint, and underneath both, something raw that he was keeping carefully leashed. I'm not asking you for anything. He stopped. Looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. I needed you to know that I meant it. She stood there and felt the weight of it settle over her. Warm and complicated and entirely too large for the ordinary scale of an ordinary evening in an ordinary kitchen. She looked at him. At the man she'd spent 6 months avoiding and 2 months pretending to endure, and she couldn't locate, anywhere in herself, the version of her feelings she'd have preferred to be having. I need time, she said. I need to think. He nodded immediately. No negotiation. No visible disappointment weaponized for her benefit. Just. Okay. I'll give you space. He packed his things in less than 20 minutes. 2 bags, the same 2 he'd arrived with, carried back through her door with the same quiet efficiency. He paused at the threshold, just briefly, just a second, and she thought he might say something else. He didn't. He looked at her with all of it still there, everything he'd just said, still visible in his face, and then he left. The door closed. The apartment was exactly as it had been before he moved in, minus the fixed hinge, and the working elevator, and the repaired mailbox, and the silence of the upstairs neighbor who had discovered, apparently, that furniture did not need to be rearranged at midnight. Frankie sat down on her sofa. She stayed there for a long time. The absence settled in slowly, then all at once, until she couldn't pretend not to feel it anymore. He stopped coming to the office. She noticed on day 2, when she walked past his floor and the energy was different, still functional. VP of operations running the visible machinery as he always had. But the particular tension that always preceded Woo-jin was gone. She asked his PA on day 4, keeping her voice carefully casual, arranging her expression into something that communicated routine inquiry, nothing significant. He's working remotely for now, the PA said, with the neutral professionalism of someone also keeping their face carefully arranged. Should I let him know you asked? No, Frankie said, too quickly. Then, no. Thank you. It's nothing. It wasn't nothing. She knew it wasn't nothing in the mornings, when she made coffee for one, and the kitchen felt too quiet. She knew it when she came home to an apartment that worked perfectly and smelled faintly of nothing, and had exactly the order she'd always maintained before him. She knew it in the evenings, when the sofa had plenty of room, and no one was folded into the other end of it with a laptop and long legs taking up the floor space. She missed him. Not abstractly. Specifically. She missed the particular sound of his footsteps, unhurried, even. She missed the weight of him in a room. That warmth she'd once catalogued as menacing and now understood as simply the presence of someone very alive paying very close attention. She missed waking up knowing he was on the other side of the wall. She missed not being afraid of the dark hallway at 2 a.m. because somehow he was the thing standing between her and everything that needed standing between. By day 6, the space she'd asked for had become the most uncomfortable thing she'd ever lived inside. She sat on her bed that evening with her phone in her hands and his name on the screen. No message typed. Just the name, just the weight of it, and she thought about what Tilly had said. That's not wanting your life back. That's wanting a different one. She got up. She packed a bag. She didn't overthink it. She had learned. In the last 2 months, that overthinking was where she went to delay things she'd already decided, and she had very clearly already decided this. Somewhere in the vicinity of a 47th floor conference room when a single word had knocked the foundation out from under everything she thought she wanted. She got in a cab. She gave the address. She watched Seattle slide past in the dark and the rain, and she sat with the nerves that were doing significant structural damage to her composure, and she did not let them win. The Penthouse building had a concierge who looked at her with professional neutrality, checked something on a screen and said, "Mr. Shin is expecting you." Which he wasn't, which meant Woo-jin had given standing instructions, which meant that somewhere in his quietly devastating certainty, he had known she would come. She found she couldn't be annoyed about it. She found she couldn't be anything right now except terrified and certain in equal measure, which was not a combination she'd experienced before and was not exactly comfortable but was, she was beginning to understand, what it felt like to want something real. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. She stepped out. He was there. He'd been sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of water, jacket off, looking at nothing in particular, and he turned when the elevator opened and went utterly still. The expression on his face, in the half-second before he controlled it, was the most unguarded thing she'd ever seen from him. Relief so complete it looked like pain. She stood there with her bag over her shoulder, breathing too fast, the nerves still doing their work, and she looked at him across the cool expanse of his penthouse and thought, there are no practical objections left. I have checked. I have checked thoroughly. There is nothing. She stepped closer. She searched his face. All of it. The ink. The dark eyes that were not dead and never had been. That were looking at her right now with the patient, absolute quality of a man who had already decided and was simply waiting to find out if the universe agreed with him. He didn't touch her. Didn't speak. Didn't move. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. Soft. Quick. Unsure. Her heart hammering. Her hands not quite knowing where to go. The kiss landing slightly off-center because she was nervous, and he was very still. She pulled back almost immediately, warmth flooding her face. He hadn't moved. Then he exhaled, a long, slow, complete release, like a man surfacing from very deep water, and the sound of it undid something in her chest that she hadn't known was held tight. She felt her cheeks burning. She looked at his collar rather than his face. Which room is mine? A beat. Another. She looked up. He was looking at her with something in his expression that she had no word for. Something that was composed entirely of warmth and restraint and the quiet, contained elation of a man who had learned not to expect good things and was in the middle of being proven wrong about that particular lesson. "Whichever one you want," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. She picked up her bag. "I'll take the master," she said. "You can have the guest room." The ghost of something, it might have been a smile, moved across his face. "Okay," he said. She walked past him toward the hallway, and she felt him watching her, and she thought, "I am in so much trouble." And then, good. The penthouse was nothing like her apartment. It was vast and cool and precise. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Elliott Bay, the city lights doubling themselves in the dark water below. Everything expensive and minimal and arranged with the aesthetic of a person who had learned to live without clutter because clutter suggested attachment. The surfaces were clean. The walls held nothing personal. It was a beautiful, expensive shell that had never been a home. She intended to fix that. Not intentionally. She wasn't staging an intervention. But she left her cardigan on the back of the kitchen chair, and her book on the coffee table, and her hair products arranged along the bathroom counter in their particular, necessary order, and within a week the penthouse had begun to collect the evidence of her the way her apartment had collected the evidence of him. Quietly, in increments, until the space felt different. He didn't say anything about it. She caught him looking, once, at her mug on the kitchen counter. The ridiculous one with "Don't talk to me before coffee" printed in block letters that she'd had since grad school. He looked at it the way someone looks at something they hadn't expected to find and can't quite believe is real. She said nothing. She made her coffee and left the mug exactly where it was. The domestic intimacy that grew between them in those first 2 weeks had a different quality than before. In her apartment, closeness had been accidental. Forced proximity producing warmth as a side effect. Here, in his space, every small thing was chosen. She chose to sit near him. He chose to make her tea before she asked for it, having memorized. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. That she wanted 2 bags steeped exactly 4 minutes. She chose to fall asleep on the vast sectional sofa with her feet tucked under her and her book open on her chest. And he chose to cover her with a blanket from the arm of the couch, folding it over her with a care so deliberate, she felt it even half asleep and lay still and let herself be looked after. They talked late into the nights, which she hadn't expected from him. This quiet, minimal man who communicated largely through presence and small actions. But alone, in the low lamplight of the living room with the city spread out below them and nowhere to be, he talked. Not about himself, at first, about ideas, about the city, about what she'd studied and what she'd wanted and how she'd ended up at SGS. He asked questions that were specific and attentive, and he listened to the answers the way he listened to everything. Completely, without checking his phone, without letting his eyes move to something more urgent. He told her, slowly, in fragments, what she could tell were fragments, his childhood and soul. A father whose expectations had a particular weight. Learning early that silence was armor. Learning even earlier that strength wasn't about volume. He stopped there, every time. Not deflecting, considering. Like he was deciding how much of the room to let her into. She noticed the other things, too. The security detail that had been discreet became less discreet. There were 2 men in the lobby now who had not been there before, whose suits fit too well, and who watched entrances and exits with a particular focus of men paid to do exactly that. There were cameras in the corridors she hadn't noticed on her first visit. There were rooms in the penthouse she hadn't been in, not locked, exactly, but closed. With the specific closed quality of doors one doesn't open without invitation. There were late-night calls that he took in a low voice in the far bedroom with the door pulled shut. She would hear the register of it through the wall, not the words, just the tone, clipped and cold and utterly unlike the voice he used with her. She would lie in the darkness and stare at the ceiling and feel the familiar shape of the question she'd been not quite asking. One night, the question pushed harder. They were in the kitchen. Late again, past midnight, the city below them quiet, and she was leaning against the counter with her tea, and he was close. Closer than he usually stood, because the kitchen was smaller than the living room, and he'd been reaching past her for something and hadn't quite moved back. The light was low. The distance between them was not. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The air in the kitchen became a specific thing. Warm, charged. The kind of air that requires a decision. She felt her pulse in her throat. He didn't move toward her. But he didn't move back, and the effort of not moving back was visible in the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the quality of his attention. She stepped back first. Not because she didn't want to close that distance. She was past pretending she didn't want that, but because the other question was still there, the one she'd been circling, and she needed to answer it before she could answer anything else. Woo-jin, she said. I know, he said quietly. He stepped back too, giving her the room she needed, the same way he always gave her the room she needed. She looked at him across the kitchen and thought. Soon. The press release was going to kill her. For drafts in, legal's revisions bleeding red across her screen. The regulatory filing due tomorrow morning. She'd been at her desk since 9. Lunch had been a granola bar. Her coffee had gone cold at 11, and she hadn't noticed until 2. She didn't hear him walk up to her. She rarely did. You look like you're trying to start a fire with your eyes. She looked up. Woo-jin was leaning against the desk behind her. Jacket still on, one hand in his pocket. Watching her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize. The look of a man observing something he fully intended to address. I'm fine, she said. He looked at the granola bar wrapper. Then back at her. Come to dinner. I have a deadline. When? Tomorrow morning. Then you have an hour to spare. He pushed off the desk. You've been at this for 9 hours, and you ate a granola bar for lunch. That's not working well. That's just working long. Come on. She opened her mouth. Frankie. One word. That frequency. She closed her mouth, looked at him, felt the real argument underneath the practical one. I see you. You haven't eaten. I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice. She saved her document. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, he agreed, and didn't look even slightly victorious about it. The restaurant was around the corner, tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist on a block she'd walked past 100 times without noticing it. Small, warm, 12 tables, windows fogged with kitchen steam that smelled of ginger and doenjang. She slid into her seat, reached for the menu, which was in Korean with handwritten English translations in a different pen, and when she looked up to ask what he recommended, she found there was already food arriving. She put the menu down. Did you? I called ahead, he said, refilling her water glass from the carafe without being asked. Of course you did. She looked at the dishes appearing, a small army of banchan, and then a bowl of something that smelled so precisely and immediately like comfort that she felt her shoulders drop by several degrees. What is this? Galbatang. Braised short rib. You need something that takes time to make. He said it simply, in the tone of someone stating a practical fact, and she looked at the bowl and thought. He knows what I need before I know I need it. She'd been thinking that thought, in various forms, for weeks. It hadn't become less significant with repetition. She picked up her spoon. They were halfway through the meal. She had stopped keeping track of time. The galbatang was doing something restorative to her brain, when the door opened. They came in loudly. 8 of them, maybe 9, filling the small entrance with the quiet authority of men who moved as though the room belonged to them. Not well dressed, deliberately the opposite. The aesthetic of people who had decided that not needing to look respectable was itself a form of status. Leather, chains, the specific kind of confidence that wasn't about ease, but about history. They were talking at a volume calibrated for outdoors, laughing at something that required the full participation of everyone in the group, and the restaurant, which had been at a comfortable inhabited hum, went fractionally quieter as they entered, the way a room does when something changes its atmosphere. They settled at a cluster of tables near the back with the efficiency of a group that had done this before, and the volume stayed high, and one of the men said something that made 2 others burst out laughing in a way that required throwing their heads back, and the couple at the table beside her exchanged a glance. Frankie ate her galbatang and didn't look at Woo-jin. Then she felt him go still. It was a specific quality of stillness, different from his usual, from the contained calm that was just how he existed. This was the stillness of a decision made. She registered it in her peripheral vision. He had stopped eating, set his chopsticks down in a single, measured motion, and was looking across the restaurant. She followed his gaze to a young waiter near the kitchen pass, who was watching the group at the back with the expression of someone quietly doing arithmetic about the evening ahead. Woo-jin looked at him for perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds something passed between them. Direction given and received, clean as a signal. The waiter straightened, swallowed. walked toward the men's table. The restaurant, Frankie noticed, had gone very slightly quieter. She wasn't the only one watching. The waiter stopped at the table, and the group's nearest member looked up with the expression of someone expecting an order to be taken. The waiter said something, low enough that Frankie caught only the shape of it, not the words, but she caught the name, clear as a struck note above the ambient noise. Mr. Shin would like you to enjoy your dinner quietly. The men looked at the waiter. The nearest one tilted his head. Another one leaned forward with the interested expression of someone who had just been given a gift. Which Mr. Shin? A snicker from the back of the group. One of them, larger than the others, leaned back in his chair and looked at the waiter with the indulgent contempt of a man who had decided this was going to be entertaining. I'd like to meet whoever thinks they can tell us how to conduct ourselves in public. He looked around at his associates with the confidence of someone who had not yet perceived the shape of the situation. Bring him over. The waiter did not move. He was sweating, not from fear of the men, but for them. And then his eyes flicked, briefly, involuntarily, toward Frankie's table. The group followed his gaze. The silence was immediate. Not gradual. Immediate. A switch thrown. Every conversation ending in the same instant. The laughter cut off mid-breath. The large man who had been leaning back in his chair came forward, both feet on the floor. Without appearing to notice he'd done it. The man beside him suddenly found his own hands interesting. Someone at the back of the group said something barely above a whisper, and no one responded. They were all looking fearfully at their table. At him. Frankie turned to Woo-jin. He was eating. Simply eating, with the calm attention of a man finishing a meal, his chopsticks moving with the unhurried precision he brought to everything. He had not looked up. He had not looked at the men. His expression was the same one he'd had when he'd asked her about the press release. The same one he always had, really. No particular reaction at all. Just that contained, unreadable stillness of someone whose inner world never betrayed itself to the room around him. At the table in the back, the men were having a conversation. She couldn't hear it. Couldn't hear anything from that table, which was itself remarkable given the volume at which they'd arrived. And the conversation involved a great deal of very careful stillness and occasional glancing at the floor. The large man, she noticed, had both hands flat on the table in the manner of someone making a conscious decision to keep them there. The waiter appeared from somewhere and approached their table. He bent to hear what they were saying. Whatever it was required him to lean in very close, because they seemed to have lost the ability to produce sound above a murmur. He straightened, nodded once, and disappeared into the back. Then he reappeared and crossed back to Frankie and Woo-jin's table. In his hands was a bottle, dark glass, no label, the kind of shape that didn't need one. Compliments and sincere apologies from the gentleman at table 5, Mr. Shin. His voice was low and measured, but she could see his pulse in his throat. They wished to express their deep regret for any disturbance and asked me to convey that they would approach in person, but do not wish to cause any further disruption to your evening. Woo-jin did not look up. He turned a piece of braised rib over with his chopsticks and ate it. The waiter stood for a beat. Then another. Frankie looked at him, at the bottle, at the men at table 5, and then made the executive decision that someone needed to receive the offering before the waiter's knees gave out. She took the bottle from his hands with a small, composed nod. Thank you, she said. He left. Quickly. She set the bottle on the table and looked at Woo-jin. What? She said, quietly and precisely, was that? He glanced at the bottle. Then he looked at her with the expression that was not quite blank and not quite amused, and lived somewhere in the borderland between the two. Do you want more galbatang? Do I? She stopped, breathed, looked at the bottle, at the men at table 5, who were speaking in hushed tones to a different waiter. The whole table reorganized into something that had nothing left of its original energy, all the volume gone out of it like air from a punctured thing. As she watched, they stood, one by one, quietly, efficiently, collecting jackets. A takeaway bag appeared. They filed out of the restaurant in the orderly, purposeful silence of people who had somewhere else to be and had decided, collectively and without visible discussion, that now was the time to go there. The door closed behind them. The restaurant exhaled. She looked around. 2 tables away, a couple were looking at their menus with the intense focus of people who had decided the menus required their complete attention. Near the window, A man was finding his phone very interesting. The waitstaff had developed a coordinated interest in the kitchen pass. Everyone who had been in the room for the last 5 minutes had made the same unspoken calculation, that they had seen something they did not fully understand, and that the appropriate response was to look at anything except Woo-jin's table. Frankie looked back at him. He was eating. He wasn't a COO who coasted on nepotism. Whatever he was, it was something considerably larger than that. "Tell me about the press release," he said. He'd refilled her water glass again. "What's the specific problem? Legal's language, or the opening line?" She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her, patient and steady and exactly as he always was, with the bottle of expensive whatever sitting beside him unremarked upon, and the restaurant re-inflating gently around them. "The opening line," she said, finally, and picked up her spoon. "It reads like legal wrote it," which they did, "and I need it to sound like a company that employs humans wrote it." "Show me when we get back," he said. "I'll look at it." She looked at him, and she ate her galbatang and said nothing, and filed the question away in the part of her mind she was increasingly aware she was going to have to open soon. She was alone in the penthouse one afternoon when the private elevator chimed. Woo-jin was in a meeting. Park had driven him. She'd stayed back, working from the kitchen island with her laptop and a second cup of tea, and the sound of the elevator, which she'd come to associate exclusively with him, made her look up with the automatic small warmth she'd stopped trying to suppress. The doors slid open. The man who stepped out was not Woo-jin. He was tall, not as tall, but close, with the kind of face that would have been classically handsome if it weren't currently arranged in an expression of thorough irritation. Leather jacket, dark jeans, expensive sneakers, keys in hand. He walked in like the concept of private property was a guideline rather than a rule, already mid-thought, already scanning the room for someone who wasn't there, and then he saw Frankie. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Who are you?" She set down her tea. "Frankie." She paused, because even now, even weeks in, the word still had a slight charge to it. Woo-jin's wife. The man blinked. A long blink, the kind that indicated significant processing. Then, slowly, the irritation on his face dissolved into something that was absolutely, genuinely, not politely suppressed laughter. "No," he said. "No way." He tilted his head, examining her with the frank curiosity of someone who had simply never learned to do anything else. "You're married to him?" "You." "Yes." He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter. Her kitchen counter. The one with her ridiculous mug on it, and walked fully into the penthouse with the ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life. "Wow," he said, with real admiration. "I genuinely didn't think any woman would be bold enough." He extended a hand, managing to make even that gesture seem slightly chaotic. "Shin Jaemin." His cousin. Frankie shook his hand, because there didn't appear to be another option. Jaemin dropped onto the sectional sofa. Her sectional sofa, the one with her book still on the armrest, and exhaled at the ceiling. "Where is he?" "Meeting." "Of course he's in a meeting." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I need him to handle something. There's the situation. I need him to make someone disappear for a while. Just until the investigation cools down. You know how it is." The temperature in the room changed. Frankie set down her mug very carefully. "Disappear." Figuratively. Mostly. A beat. Then Jaemin turned his head toward her with the particular attention of someone who had just noticed something. "What kind of face is that? What investigation?" He sat up. Slowly. The restless energy that had been running through him since he stepped off the elevator went quiet, replaced by something more careful. He looked at her the way people look at a situation they've accidentally walked into and are now assessing for exits. "You don't know, do you?" It wasn't a question. Frankie kept her voice even. "Know what?" Jaemin exhaled, a long, slightly theatrical sigh, the kind that preceded inconvenient honesty. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "You realize," he said, "who you're married to, right?" "I know who he is." "Do you though?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and something shifted in his face, not unkind, but serious in a way that lived underneath the performance, like the actual person surfacing for a moment. "He can make people disappear. Not figuratively, actually gone. Off the map. Out of reach. He can make investigations close." He can make problems stop being problems. People who terrify everyone else are afraid of my cousin. A pause. Waited. There's a reason for that. Her stomach dropped. Not because she thought he would hurt her, but because she realized how easily he could. Frankie held his gaze. And the company? She asked quietly. Jaemin studied her. The company is real. He built it. He's brilliant, and he works twice as hard as anyone gives him credit for. Another pause. But there's more than the company. He stopped there. She could see him drawing a line, giving her enough, not giving her everything, making a calculation about what was fair and what was Woo-jin's to tell. The rest, he said, he should tell you himself. He stood, collecting his keys, and the manic energy that had filled the room since he'd stepped off the elevator was quieter now, replaced by something more serious, more considered. He looked at her with the frank, unceremonious attention she was already coming to recognize as simply how he was. For the record, he said, I've been waiting for years for someone to get past him. He's been alone for a long time, in ways that he would never admit and that are very bad for a person. He said it matter-of-factly, without sentiment, the way people say things when they've been worried about someone for so long that the worry has become a background condition. He's never brought anyone into his space before. Not like this. Frankie looked at him. What do you mean, like this? Voluntarily. Jaemin gestured, encompassing the penthouse, the mug on the counter, the cardigan on the chair, all the small evidence of her that had accumulated in his space. He let you in. He wanted you here. A pause. That's not nothing for him. That's everything. He doesn't do that. She held Jaemin's gaze for a moment, and felt something settle in her chest. Not new information, exactly, but confirmation. The kind that lands differently when it comes from outside. I know, she said quietly. He nodded once. Then the easy grin came back, the armor of it, and he headed for the elevator. For what it's worth, he said. I came to ask him a favor. The fact that I told you any of this, a small shrug, means I think you deserve to know what you're in. The elevator doors opened. He's going to be furious with me. Probably, Frankie agreed. The doors closed. She stood in the empty penthouse for a long time, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than anything he'd said. She left before Woo-jin got home. Not running. She was careful about that, careful to be honest with herself about what this was. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid for herself, not in the way Jaemin might have feared she would be. She was afraid of something more specific and more interior. The gap between what she knew and what was real. The shape of the thing she'd been living beside, without seeing its full outline. She went to Tilly's. She sat on Tilly's sofa, drank Tilly's wine, and said, I think my husband is not just a COO. Tilly looked at her for a long moment. The scary one. Yes. How not just COO are we talking? Frankie thought about Jaemin's face when he'd said people who terrify everyone else are afraid of my cousin, and about a table of men who had come in loud and left quickly, quietly, without finishing their meals. Are you in danger? She considered the question honestly, thought about every moment she'd been near him. The hallway with Dave, the homeowners' meeting, the conference room, the nights in the penthouse. Thought about the quality of his attention, the nature of his protectiveness, the absolute specificity of the care he'd extended to her since the first moment he'd decided she mattered. No, she said. I don't think so. Then what are you going to do? She looked at her wine. Go back and ask him to tell me the truth. Tonight. Tonight. Woo-jin heard the elevator. He'd been standing at the window for 40 minutes. The city below dark and glittering, his phone in his hand with Jaemin's last message on the screen. She left. I'm sorry. I swear I didn't tell her everything. She took it well. And the sound of the elevator made him turn so fast it would have been undignified if there had been anyone to see it. Frankie stepped out. Calm. Steady. Her eyes finding him across the room with a directness that was somehow the most frightening thing he'd faced in years. Not because it was hostile, but because it wasn't. Because she'd come back, which meant she intended to know, and she intended to know because she was still here, and she was still here because... She crossed the room toward him. Tell me the truth. He went still. Your cousin said things, she said, stepping closer, her voice quiet and even and certain. Enough to scare me. Enough to make me realize I don't know who I'm living with. So tell me. She stopped, close enough that he could see her breathing. Steady, determined, the kind of brave that costs something and pays it anyway. Who are you really? The silence stretched for 4 seconds. 5. Then Woo-jin exhaled. Slow. Complete. The sound of a door opening, and he told her. He sat down at the kitchen island. She sat across from him, and the city was dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the penthouse was very quiet, and she looked at him and waited. The company was real, and the company was his. Built from a foundation his father had laid in ways he'd spent years trying to convert into something cleaner. His family had reach, not the kind that showed up in boardrooms, the other kind, older, more complicated, organized around obligations and leverage, and the particular grammar of power that wrote itself in silence rather than speech. People called when they needed impossible things. He answered. Not from cruelty, from obligation, from inheritance, from the understanding that the alternative was chaos that would harm more people than the compliance did. He told her about his father, precise, minimal sentences, the way people speak about pain they've learned to carry with composure. About inheriting not just a business, but a position, a web of obligations, a set of enemies who needed to see that the structure held. About building the legitimate side of it from the inside out, converting it slowly, changing what it produced. He watched her face while he talked. She wasn't afraid. He could see it clearly, no fear, just the careful, attentive processing she brought to everything, taking something seriously enough to understand it before responding. The distance I kept from you, he said, his voice stripped of its usual control now, rougher and more real. When you first joined the company, that wasn't indifference. It was because of this. He held her gaze, and something unguarded flickered through him. I noticed you immediately, he said. Your mind. The way you ran your team. The way you were warm with people without losing authority. You walked into a room, and everything in me reacted, and he exhaled, a quiet, frustrated sound. I didn't want you to know any of that. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, almost absently. I didn't want to bring you into my world. I didn't want you anywhere near the things I deal with. So I kept my distance. I told myself it was the responsible thing, the honorable thing. A small, humorless smile touched his mouth. It was also the hardest thing I've done in a long time. She looked at him steadily. So you decided for me? Yes. Without asking. Yes. He held her gaze. I thought it was protection. It was also control. She said, gently but clearly. Something moved across his expression. Not defensiveness, but the quiet discomfort of recognition. Yes, he said, softer. I know that now. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she raised her hand and touched his face, her palm against his jaw, warm and gentle, and the contact moved through him like a current, settling every coiled thing in his chest. He closed his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He found her face with his hands, careful, both palms cradling her as though she were something breakable and precious, which was the entire problem and also the entire solution. And he kissed her with everything he'd been holding since a conference room, a single word, and an elevator ride home. Slow and deep and full of the weight of weeks. Weeks of restraint, of maintained distance, of wanting and choosing not to act. She kissed him back without hesitation, her hands finding his chest, his shirt, the solid, real fact of him. And the kiss became the kind that has no performance in it, that is only its own truth. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against his collarbone. His arms were around her, holding her with the specific, certain quality of a man holding something he intends to keep. Woo-jin, she said, quietly, into the fabric of his shirt. Yes, he said, which wasn't an answer to anything she'd asked, but an answer all the same. He held her there for a long moment, her breath warm against his collarbone, his hands steady at her jaw, as though letting go would undo something neither of them wanted undone. When she finally lifted her face, he kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, a quiet unraveling of every boundary they'd kept in place. The rest of the night unfolded in the kind of silence that didn't need words, only the simple, undeniable fact of choosing each other. A month passed, and then another, and then a third, and the penthouse became the kind of place it had never been before. Her coffee mug stayed on the counter. Her reading glasses lived on the kitchen island. Her playlists came through the speakers at breakfast. Warm, unhurried things that she sang softly to while she moved around the kitchen, unself-conscious and easy in her own space, and he would watch her from over his laptop with an expression she'd long since stopped pretending not to notice. He made her tea at exactly the right strength. She stole his hoodies. He had good hoodies, soft and dark and impossibly large on her, and she wore them in the evenings with the sleeves swallowed past her hands, and she knew by now what his face did when she walked out in one. She let it do that thing. She had stopped managing it. They had routines. Morning coffee, shared in comfortable quiet. Saturday markets, where he stood slightly behind her and let her examine every stall at her own pace. The security detail at a discreet distance that she'd learned not to look for and not to mention. Late evenings on the sofa with their respective work. The city below them, the lamp low, her feet occasionally migrating across the cushions until they were in his lap, which was where they consistently ended up, and where he consistently left them. His inner circle, the few people who saw him in both registers, boardroom and otherwise, noticed. She met them gradually. Kim Jin, his head of security, a broad-shouldered man who had regarded her with the evaluating silence of someone whose job was to assess threats, and who had, over the course of 3 encounters, reclassified her as something else entirely. Jisoo, the only woman in his inner circle, who ran logistics with the specific ruthless efficiency of someone who had never once been underestimated twice. A handful of others, each careful with her at first, then less careful, then simply themselves. They saw what she did, that he was different when she was in the room, that the permanent low-grade tension he carried, something she'd once read as coldness and now understood as constant vigilance, eased, slightly, measurably, when she was near. That he smiled, not often, not openly, but in the small, private ways she'd learned to catch. That when she spoke, in any room, he stopped whatever he was doing and listened. "You're good for him," Jisoo told her once, directly, in the kitchen while Woo-jin was occupied elsewhere. "He's been doing this alone for a long time." "I know," she said. The threat arrived one mid-morning. She'd been coming back from coffee with a colleague, a woman from the finance team, no ulterior motives, just coffee, when she noticed it on the walk from the cafe to the building. Not dramatically. Not a movie-style realization with swelling music. Just the specific, quiet wrongness of a silver car parked in the same spot it had been that morning. Engine running. No visible reason to be idling in a no-parking zone. She went inside. She didn't mention it. But she thought about it on the elevator, and she thought about it in the afternoon, and by evening she had decided it was probably nothing, and then reconsidered, and decided she didn't actually believe it was nothing. When she arrived back at the penthouse that evening, she noticed the silver car again, parked half a block down, engine running, exactly as it had been outside the office. She mentioned it to Woo-jin at dinner. Casually, the way she'd learned to deliver information to him. Not with alarm, which activated something in him she didn't want to activate unnecessarily, but as a fact, a detail, something she'd noticed. He put down his fork. The quality of his stillness changed. Not dramatically, he didn't stand, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything that would look significant to an outside observer. But she'd learned him, by now, the way she'd learned her own apartment, and she felt the change. "Silver car," he said. "Running engine." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone, said 3 quiet words in Korean, and set it down again. Later that night, when she glanced out the penthouse window, the silver car was no longer idling across the street. No headlights. Just an empty stretch of curb where the wrongness had been. She didn't ask what had happened to it. She thought about asking, and she thought about everything Jaemin had told her, and she thought about the careful, absolute protection this man had extended to her since before she'd known she needed it, and she decided that some answers lived in the space between trust and testimony, and that she was comfortable in that space. What she was not comfortable with was Woo-jin's face the following evening. He was standing at the window again, his native habitat. She decided. The city spread below him like something he was responsible for. He turned when she came in, and what she saw in his expression was not the contained readiness she'd seen the night before. It was something else. Something that looked like guilt. Woo-jin. The car wasn't random, he said. No preamble, no softening. She'd asked him, weeks ago, to give her the truth directly, and he had not forgotten. Someone testing whether you were a viable point of leverage. They know what you are to me. The words settled over her. What you are to me. Even now, even in the middle of this, the phrase did something in her chest. Are they going to try again? No. The single word had the quality of a door closing on the subject. Then, quieter. I handled it. She believed him. What happened next, she hadn't expected. He crossed the room to her, which he rarely initiated, which was one of the things she'd come to understand as part of how he was built. Always leaving the distance up to her, and he stopped 2 feet away, and he looked at her with the most exposed expression she'd ever seen on his face. More open than the conference room. More open than the kitchen confession. This was something different. If you want to leave, he said, I won't stop you. A pause, and she could see what it cost him. Could see it in the effort of his jaw, the absolute control keeping his voice steady. If being with me is a danger to you, if this isn't the life you wanted, I would understand. He held her gaze. I'll never make you stay. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the summons. She thought about eggs made perfectly in her small kitchen. She thought about let her finish, and a ring that fit like something chosen, and the elevator doors opening late at night on a man who had gone absolutely still at the sight of her and her overnight bag. She thought, you absolute man. You genuinely believe you're giving me something by saying this. She stepped closer. Woo-jin. She took his face in both hands, the same way she had the night she'd touched him for the first time, and she felt him go still under her palms. That total, overwhelmed stillness of a man receiving something he hadn't known how to ask for. I'm not going anywhere. His hands came up and covered hers, holding them against his face. I'm exactly where I chose to be, she said. I chose this. I chose you. And you're going to have to get comfortable with that, because I don't change my mind once I've decided. Something broke open in his expression. The last wall, the deepest one, the one that had been standing since long before she'd ever walked into his building. The warmth behind it was enormous, pouring forward unguarded. He kissed her like she was an answer, like she was the answer. The one he'd stopped expecting and had tried, for years, to be fine without. She kissed him back with everything she had, her hands moving to his chest, his arms wrapping around her completely, lifting her slightly off the floor with the easy strength of a man who had stopped being careful, who had finally been given permission to stop being careful, and the warmth of it, and the rightness of it, and the solid, present realness of him around her felt like the most uncomplicated thing she'd ever known. When they finally came up for air, she was laughing, quietly, helplessly, for no reason except that she was happy, and it had been a while since happiness had felt this simple. He pulled back to look at her. The warmth in his face was uncontained and unprecedented, and so entirely at odds with every first impression she'd ever formed of him that she laughed again. What? He said, and his voice was soft. Nothing, she said. You're different when you're not hiding. He looked at her for a moment. Better. She reached up and touched his cheekbones, a thing she'd been wanting to do for months, and which felt exactly as she'd imagined. Smooth, slight, and inexplicably dear. Yes, she said. Much better. He caught her hand before she could pull it back, brought it to his mouth, and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to the inside of her wrist. A place that felt too intimate for how gentle it was, too honest for how quiet the moment had become. Her breath stilled. His eyes lifted to hers. And in that small, unguarded silence, she understood exactly what she meant to him, and exactly how much of him she already had. He didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he laced their fingers together and guided her toward the bedroom with a quiet certainty that felt less like desire and more like inevitability. The door closed behind them, soft as a promise. 1 year later, the penthouse was warm. Not just in temperature. In the way that spaces become warm when they are genuinely lived in, when two people's lives have been overlapping long enough that the space itself holds the evidence of it. Her book on the coffee table, his jacket on the chair, their coffee mugs on the counter, his clean and sensible, hers still aggressively declarative. Her plants on the window ledge, which she'd transported from her old apartment in stages and which had, against all reasonable expectation, thrived in the full-length light of 41st floor windows. The apartment had not let her go quietly in the end. She'd sorted through it methodically, room by room, over a Saturday, and when she handed her keys to the realtor who would lease it out, she'd stood in the doorway and felt mostly grateful for what it had been, for the life she'd built in it, and for the particular clerical error that had walked her out of it and into something she never would have chosen and couldn't imagine giving back. She was still employed at Shin Global Systems, which had required some navigating of HR policy and a frank conversation with legal about recusal procedures and conflict of interest protocols. She kept her title and her team. She attended meetings that Woo-jin also attended and maintained a professionalism that she was moderately proud of, given that she now knew, among other things, exactly how he took his coffee and what he looked like when he laughed, which was rare and entirely devastating and something she intended to keep producing for the foreseeable future. She'd met his mother, which had been its own complete and separate ordeal, involving a flight to Seoul and a dinner at which Frankie had been studied with the absolute attention of a woman who had raised someone like Woo-jin and wanted to understand what kind of person had finally gotten past him. At the end of the dinner, Woo-jin's mother had looked at her for a long moment across the table and then said something in Korean. She says, Woo-jin had translated, with an expression that was carefully controlled but fractionally warm, that you must be remarkable. Why? Frankie had asked. Because you don't seem afraid of him, his mother had answered, in perfect English, and smiled. She'd understood then that she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking, and that the relationship between her and this formidable woman had been established, and that it would be, like most things in Woo-jin's orbit, quietly significant. Jaemin had become something unexpected, a genuine presence in her life, appearing uninvited about every 2 weeks, consuming whatever was in the refrigerator, and offering a running commentary on the household that was both infuriating and oddly comforting. He treated her like a person rather than a variable, which she had decided was his highest quality, and he looked at Woo-jin differently now, with something underneath the relentless teasing that looked a great deal like relief. The night of their first real anniversary, the real one, not the audit date, but the night he'd stood in a conference room and said no in a voice that meant yes, Woo-jin came home late. Frankie was on the sofa when the elevator opened, her feet curled under her, the city outside doing its quiet, rainlit thing. She looked up when he came in. This man she'd called cold and unapproachable and aloof. This man she'd spent 6 months carefully not seeing. And he crossed the room and sat beside her without preamble, and she moved automatically into the space he made for her, fitting against his side with the ease of something practiced into certainty. He reached into his jacket pocket. The box was small and dark. He set it on the coffee table between them. Open it, he said. She did. The ring inside was nothing like the one she was wearing. Not the midnight blue oval. Not the elegant audit prop that had fit too well and meant too much and had stayed on her finger for a year without her quite deciding to take it off. This was different. Simpler and more specific. A slim band of dark gold with a single stone. An oval of deep cognac that caught the lamplight and held it, warm and complex, like something that had been considered carefully and chosen once, and was intended to be permanent. She looked at it for a long moment. That one was the legal requirement, he said, nodding at the ring on her hand. This one is mine. She felt the warmth of the words travel from her chest into her throat and settle there, full and unhurried. She looked at him. He was watching her with the open expression she still wasn't entirely used to, still marveled at a little, every time. This man who had spent so long behind walls that the view from outside them was its own kind of wonder. You're very sure of yourself, she said. Yes, he agreed, without a trace of apology. She laughed. That quiet, helpless laugh she'd been laughing with increasing frequency over the last 12 months. The one that meant she was happy in a way that still surprised her. She took off the first ring, placed it on the coffee table with the gentle care it deserved. It had done its job, after all, better than any piece of jewelry had a right to, and held out her hand. He took it in both of his. She watched his hands, tattooed, strong, careful, slide the ring into place. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He paid attention. Shin Frankie, he said quietly. An experiment. A question. Sterling Shin, she said firmly. We've discussed this. The almost smile moved across his face. We've discussed it, he agreed. I haven't conceded. You will. Possibly. She leaned up and kissed him, unhurried, certain. The kiss of a person who knows where home is and has stopped being surprised to find themselves there. His arms came around her, and outside the windows Seattle went on in all its gray and green and rain-soaked persistence, and she was exactly where she'd chosen to be, which was exactly where she intended to stay. She thought about the summons. The one-page note, delivered to her desk, no please, no context. Mr. Shin requests your presence. She thought. What a strange and absolute stroke of luck. That someone in the government's identity department had a very bad day and made a very significant clerical error. She thought. I should send them a card. Woo-jin's hand moved up to her hair, and she settled against him, and the city glittered below the windows, and none of the things she'd been afraid of turned out to be the things she should have been afraid of. The only thing she hadn't been prepared for was this. The warmth of it. The size of it. How thoroughly, irrevocably, completely right it was.